Globally, better laws and enforcement are needed on farms. More than 70% of all child laborers can be found working in agriculture.
In the U.S., we need better laws in agriculture because I should not have been working in the fields when I was 12.
Farms can be dangerous workplaces. Children shouldn't be doing hazardous work or be exposed to pesticides.
The U.S. created child labor laws in the 1930s, but left out children working on farms from most protections. We must close the loopholes that endanger children. Let us end exploitative child labor on farms in the U.S. and globally.
Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Ryan. I'm the chairperson of the Global March Against Child Labor and the Asia Director for the Solidarity Center. And I want to welcome everyone to today's joint Child Labor Coalition and International Labor Organization event, marking World Day Against Child Labor. The title of today's event, A Growing Problem, the Pandemic's Impact and the Challenge of Child Labor in Agriculture, highlights the critical need to continue and deepen efforts to combat exploitive child labor in agriculture. I'd like to make a couple of opening statements, but before we get started, just a few administrative notes for everyone on the webinar. This session, number one, the session is being recorded and will be available on the ILO Office for the United States and Canada websites after the program. And second, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the discussion today, bringing back representatives of both of our panels. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function throughout the discussion today, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. At the last global conference on child labor in Argentina in 2017, there was good news and there was bad news. The relatively good news was that the number of child laborers had dropped to 152 million. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But that number is a significant victory in reducing child labor over the previous decade. The bad news was one area where child labor has increased, and particularly for girl children, was in agriculture. This trend was happening before the pandemic, but now the COVID crisis is accelerating it. In mid-2020, the Global March carried out a survey on COVID-19 and child labor with 40 of its civil society members from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The survey confirmed that the world was likely facing an increase in child labor across sectors, not only in the agriculture sector, which is the largest employer of child labor, but also in the service sector, which will equally face an unprecedented rise in the number of working children. Girls who already face the double burden of school and household chores are predicted to be worse affected, pushing them out of school, very possibly never to return. We'll be hearing later from Kevin Cassidy of the ILO about the new global estimate on child labor, which should demonstrate how this moment demands that the year 2021 is a crucial year for serious concerted action against child labor, and not just a feel-good commemoration of work already done. As part of that work, the Global March, trade unions, and civil society organizations are pushing on governments and the UN system to recognize and step up to address the increased vulnerability of children today. The International Trade Union Confederation's Fair Share campaign for government budgets and family social protection is a clear clarion call for governments to have a more systemic approach to addressing child labor. Even in normal times, it's unconscionable for children to be so exploited. Now, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, this crisis should never be used to justify existing or increasing child labor. We'll see how interconnected these aspects are in our program today. And to begin the proceedings, I would like to introduce, just pull up a document here. I would like to introduce Sally Greenberg, who will be making opening remarks. Sally is the co-chair of the Child Labor Coalition and executive director of the National Consumers League. Sally joined the league as executive director in 2007, coming from the Consumers Union, where she worked from 1997 to 2007 on product liability and food safety issues, along with auto and product safety. Previously, Sally worked at the U.S. Department of Justice Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, and prior to that, she spent a decade serving as the Eastern States Civil Rights Counsel for the Anti-Defamation League, based in Boston. Sally, the floor is yours.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Tim. And thanks for highlighting all the very, very serious concerns we're going to be focused on today. This has truly been a year like no other for the world in so many ways. The pandemic has just clobbered all of us. And it's really so sad to think that children are bearing the brunt of so much of this suffering. Before I get started, I want to spend special thanks, though, to our speakers and to our ILO co-hosts, Kevin, Andrea, and Sarah, who put so many hours into making this happen. And I want to thank our CLC member planning team as well. And of course, to Reed Mackey, who's the glue that keeps the CLC together and all of us charging forward. The Child Labor Coalition has worked to reduce the exploitation of children at work since 1989. I'm also the executive director of the National Consumers League, as Tim said, and we have, as an organization, been a leader in the fight against child labor since our founding in 1899. I'm so pleased that we're able to gather here today. This is the eve of the World Day Against Child Labor, which is commemorated tomorrow, June 12th, and we're celebrating the UN year to eliminate child labor, which has witnessed a great deal of feverish activity all over the world, all designed to reduce work that exploits and harms children. Unfortunately, this terrible pandemic has afflicted so much of the world, and it threatens to increase the prevalence of child labor globally. The first half of our event today will focus on the challenges that we face. CLC member Joe Becker is among the experts we'll hear from, with new research from Joe's organization, Human Rights Watch, on the pandemic's impact on child labor in 3 countries. The ILO's Kevin Cassidy is going to discuss just released new global child labor estimates, which we wait for eagerly every 4 years. It's so important that we have documentation of where we are in the battle against child labor. And our partner, Anjali Kochar, will tell us about the global campaign to guarantee that children have their fair share of resources, policies, and protections. The second half of our event is going to focus on agriculture, a sector in which 7 in 10 child laborers toil, often under hazardous conditions. Judy Gearhart, the CLC's International Issues Committee Chair, will moderate that panel, and she's going to start by giving us an overview of efforts to reduce child labor in the cocoa sector. We'll also hear from Norma Flores Lopez, the CLC's Domestic Issues Chair, about efforts to end exploitive and dangerous child work in the United States agriculture, which is a problem many Americans remain unaware of. Yesterday, the U.S. Department of Labor awarded the prestigious Iqbal Masih Child Labor Elimination Award to Norma, and we're so delighted to applaud Norma's lifelong work to fight child labor. And that award was also given to the International Labor Organization. They're co-recipients. So we congratulate heartily both of them, and we're so appreciative that Norma both sits on the NCL board and is so active with the CLC. And we really appreciate the partnership with the ILO. We're also going to hear from a farm worker youth. I think you saw her on the video, Jacqueline Palacios, who spent her teen years working in the field. And last but not least, union leader Andy Tagway will discuss agricultural unions in Africa and their role in securing living incomes for workers and eliminating child labor. The challenges we face as an advocacy community are daunting. And some of the news today, I hope will compel all of us to redouble our efforts to protect children from exploitive work. If we do not do this, millions more children will become trapped in child labor because of the impacts related to the pandemic. We have made, as Tim said, steady progress in reducing child labor between 2000 and 2020. Nearly 100 million fewer child laborers, which gives me hope every single day that our efforts are not going unappreciated or unaffected. We cannot let, though, any backsliding happen when it comes to child labor globally. So at this point, I'm going to turn to our keynote speaker who is joining us by video. He is none other than Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, who was confirmed and sworn in March of this year. He is a former trade unionist, a former mayor of Boston, and a lifelong champion of equity and fairness, striving to achieve decent work, worker empowerment, and a world free of child labor and forced labor across the globe. The Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs oversees tens of millions of dollars in child labor programming and collects enormous amount of data on child labor. They make thousands of recommendations to other nations in how to reduce child labor. So the Department of Labor is critically important. Our Department of Labor is critically important in enforcing existing laws and protections. We're delighted that Secretary Walsh has been able to join us by video, so I'll turn things over to Secretary Walsh. Thank you all so much.
Thank you to the Child Labor Coalition and the International Labor Organization for the invitation to speak today. This World Day Against Child Labor, in the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor, we recognize the urgency of this work. As we learned yesterday, roughly 160 million children are subjected to child labor. 79 million experience the worst forms of abuse, including forced labor and commercial sexual exploitation. And 70% of child laborers, 112 million children, are working in agriculture, often starting at a young age. Those numbers represent real children in need of protection. They also represent our call to action. We made progress on child labor over the decades of collective international action. But that progress can disappear if we are not vigilant. The pandemic has put millions of vulnerable children and families around the world at further risk. And it's underscored the need for greater protections for children and workers in times of crisis. That's why child labor enforcement is a priority for the United States Department of Labor and the entire U.S. government. We are committed to enforcing child labor laws in every full investigation that we conduct under the U.S. Fair Labor Standards Act. And compliance is a core component of training in our National Agricultural Enforcement and Education Initiative. Last fiscal year, the department's Wage and Hour Division concluded more than 1,100 investigations in agriculture. We examined child labor compliance in every single one of those investigations. The Wage and Hour Division also conducted 4,600 outreach events to educate young workers about their rights and employers about their responsibility. Outside the United States, projects funded by our Bureau of International Labor Affairs continue to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact. In Mexico, our Field of Hopes project is working closely with the sugarcane sector on responsible recruitment of workers. And we are working with local authorities to improve health and working conditions of migrant workers. One of the guiding principles in our work is the value of partnerships. We are the most effective when we bring together willing partners, including government agencies, civil organizations, and companies. The Biden-Harris administration has made it clear that we need to build back better for everyone as we emerge from this global pandemic. As part of that vision, the president has directed the United States government to prioritize human rights. That means addressing all forms of discrimination, including gender inequality, systemic racism, and of course, child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. I want to commend the Child Labor Coalition and the ILO for the work that you do, bringing together stakeholders, raising awareness, and inspire action, both in the United States and abroad. I look forward to our continued partnership in the global fight to end child labor.
Okay. So thank you very, very much, Secretary of Labor Walsh, and thank you for your comments on today, for the program today. Greatly appreciate your participation and commitment to helping combat child labor at home and abroad. And thank you as well, Sally, for your remarks on all the work of the Child Labor Coalition and the National Consumers League. Next, I'd like to introduce Kevin Cassidy, Director of the ILO Office for the United States and Canada and representative to the Bretton Woods and multilateral organizations, to give some brief highlights of the new estimates on child labor, a new report that's come out. Kevin has nearly 4 decades of international development experience and has been an invaluable partner in helping develop this event and further efforts to build partnerships to combat child labor. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Tim, thanks very much. As Secretary of Labor Walsh has noted, the global estimates for the ILO and Unicef, this was a joint project. These estimates were released yesterday and show the number of children in child labor has risen to 160 million worldwide. Just to put that in context, this brings us back to the numbers of 2015. So it has unraveled years of really hard work. This increase of 8.4 million children in the last 4 years, with millions more at risk due to COVID-19, because the estimates were developed before the full impact of COVID was known. It's the first time in 2 decades that the number of child laborers has risen. In sub-Saharan Africa, population growth, recurrent crises, extreme poverty, inadequate social safety nets, all of this has conspired to lead to an additional 16.6 million children in child labor over the past 4 years. Even in regions where there had been some headway since 2016, such as Asia and the Pacific region, Latin America, the Caribbean, COVID-19 is endangering that progress. Agriculture still accounts for a very high percentage. It's about 70% of the children are in child labor in agriculture. And the percentages is basically unchanged since the estimates of 2016. And one of the reasons today that we're focusing on agriculture is to really address the issue of agriculture and see what we can do as activists, as policymakers. I'd like to introduce our speakers for our first panel to get really down into the work on the ground that is happening and to have a real lively discussion. Hopefully our audience will join in by submitting questions to the Q&A function. Our first speaker will be Joe Becker. Joe is the Advocacy Director of the Children's Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch. And as the founding chairperson of the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, Joe has helped campaign successfully for the international treaty banning the forced recruitment of children under the age of 18 for their use in armed conflict. Joe has conducted field investigations on children's rights in Burma, Myanmar, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Morocco, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and in the United States. Our second speaker today on this particular panel will be Anjali Kochhar. Anjali has worked on social justice issues for more than 25 years and is currently the executive director of the Kailash Satyarthi Children's Foundation, US. Anjali has previously worked with the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, where she focused on child labor issues in India's carpet industry and served on the International Steering Committee for the Global March Against Child Labor. Joe, Anjali, I really want to thank you for being here today and lending your voice and expertise to this. Joe, as Sally has indicated, can you provide us with an overview for the audience, the main findings of your recent research on the impact of COVID-19 on child labor? Joe?
Thank you, Kevin. We know that the pandemic is heightening child labor risks in at least 4 key ways. First, massive job losses, loss of income have put millions of families into poverty and struggling to meet their basic needs. Secondly, of course, massive school closures have forced nearly 1.5 billion children out of school. And for those that can't access distance learning, working often seems like a logical alternative. Third is that nearly 3.8 million people globally have died from COVID-19, leaving hundreds of thousands of children without one or both parents, and often pressured to support themselves. And then finally, restrictions because of COVID-19 have limited monitoring and enforcement of child labor laws. 2 weeks ago, Human Rights Watch launched a new report that documents how these factors have played out in children's lives. Between January and March of this year, we and our partners interviewed over 80 children in 3 countries, Ghana, Nepal, and Uganda. We chose these 3 countries because each has made significant progress in reducing poverty and child labor in recent decades. Each is also a pathfinder country, which means that they've made an explicit commitment to accelerate their progress in ending child labor. But each is also lagging behind their neighbors and other countries in using cash transfers, which we know is one of the most powerful tools to prevent child labor. The children that we interviewed told us how their parents lost jobs when businesses shut down, couldn't get to markets to sell their goods, or lost customers during lockdowns. Many children felt that they had no choice but to work to help their families survive. We interviewed children who were in brick kilns, carpet factories, gold mines, stone quarries, fisheries, in construction and agriculture. Others sold food or items on the street. Many described work that was clearly hazardous. The boy on the left is working at a stone quarry where flying stones often cause injuries. The boy on the right is at a construction site where he was carrying bags of heavy cement up and down 4 flights of stairs for 10 hours every day. In Ghana and Uganda, we talked with children working at gold mines, carrying heavy loads of ore, breathing in dust and fumes from processing machines, and handling toxic mercury to extract the gold. Many worked long hours, particularly during school closures and lockdowns. In Nepal, a 14-year-old girl told us that she started weaving at a carpet loom at 4 o'clock in the morning and didn't finish until 10 o'clock at night. Many of the children were paid very little for their work, if they were paid at all. Some said that their earnings were so meager that they still went hungry on many days. Most of the children returned to school as soon as they could, but continued to work before or after class. In other cases, schools had reopened, but children had not yet returned because they felt that their families still needed their income or they needed money for school expenses. One boy told us, "If I go back to school now, my family is just going to go further into debt." We know that the longer that children stay out of school, the less likely they are to return. Unicef says 24 million children that were forced out of school during the pandemic will probably drop out for good. Our research paints a troubling picture, and the heightened risk of child labor is not going away. Since our interviews just a few months ago, both Uganda and Nepal have undergone a second round of school closures and lockdowns. But the most important message is that child labor is not an inevitable consequence of the pandemic. When governments provide families with cash assistance, this can help them meet their needs without resorting to child labor. In fact, cash transfers help drive the reduction in child labor rates between 2000 and 2016. We're calling on governments and donors to take urgent action, to get kids back into school as soon as it's safe, to enforce their child labor laws, and to scale up cash allowances to help struggling families. Thank you.
Joe, thanks very much for that and for those insights. And hopefully we'll have a couple of seconds to drill down a little bit deeper into some of the issues that you have raised here. I would like at this time to introduce our next speaker. Anjali, you are now with the Kailash Satyarthi Foundation and have been a global leader in the fight to combat child labor. And I know you've made some specific recommendations on what more needs to be done in your work and to drive policy. Can you share with us a brief summary of what those recommendations are and what work you're doing these days?
Thank you, Kevin. It is a pleasure to be here today with you, Joe, the other panelists, the Child Labor Coalition, and the wider community to talk about the challenges before us. You know, it's been a day since the new pre-pandemic numbers were released, and I imagine that many of us are still trying to understand them or at least come to terms with them. Additionally, the stories Joe has just shared of children in Nepal, Ghana, and Uganda who have been forced to work as a result of the pandemic is not only heartbreaking, but indicative of the increased vulnerabilities to child labor that children have faced and will continue to face during the pandemic. Since the global estimates were released, the word that has been coming up for me the most is why. Why have we seen an increase in child labor when in the 4 years prior to the pandemic, the world became $10 trillion richer? $10 trillion richer, and 16 million more children between the ages of 5 and 11 are now working to grow our food, make our clothes, and mine our minerals. Where is our collective outrage? The pandemic has laid bare what many of us already knew, that structural inequalities maintain the marginalization of the world's most vulnerable children and their families. Long established structural and institutionalized discrimination against these marginalized communities has created systemic generational poverty. And this violence of poverty rooted in discrimination is a driver of child labor. Child laborers are overwhelmingly from communities whose lives haven't mattered to those in power, whether in their own country or internationally, for generations. Ethnic minority groups, tribal and indigenous people, religious minorities, lower caste children, and migrants. As we all know, it is the children that are paying the heaviest price for this discrimination. Child laborers and their families have so few of the world's resources that they have been forced to work in order to survive. The children who are trapped in child labor are the same children who are denied an education, who suffer the worst health outcomes, and have little access to clean water and sanitation. It would cost just 1 week of the G7's 2020 COVID relief spending to establish a $100 billion global social protection fund, creating a safety net for every child in the world, regardless of where they were born and what they looked like. A basic share of the world's resources given to every child. Tackling the extreme poverty that leads to child labor is something that we should all be working on, because we are not simply looking at a failure of SDG 8.7, but of the whole SDG commitment to leaving no one behind. When 16 million more children aged 5 to 11 are forced to work, many all day, every day, just to have enough to eat, then it is clear we are leaving more behind, not less. The challenge before us then is to ensure that every child receives their fair share of resources, policies, and social protection, so that child labor ends once and for all, and the color of our skin or our social and economic place in society does not condemn us to a life of servitude. Thanks, Kevin.
Angela, thanks very much. I think we all wonder, how can we have so much wealth and so much misery existing side by side? We are coming to the end of this panel, but if I may, if you can indulge us just very quickly, I'd like to ask one question to Joe and one to Anjali. Joe, you spoke a bit about cash transfers, which is really great in theory. It does work. We've seen it work. But in the global South, with very limited resources, how do these countries have the fiscal space? Over to you, Joe.
Yeah, well, the truth about cash transfers is that a little bit can go a long way. There have been studies, for example, in Honduras, as little as $4 per child per month, increased school enrollment by nearly 1/3 and reduced child labor by almost 50%. In Ghana, simulations found that just $1 per child per day could lift 200,000 children out of poverty and reduce child poverty by 6%. This is one of the most cost-effective policy tools that we have. It not only reduces child labor, it reduces poverty, it increases school enrollment, it even reduces domestic violence. And by putting cash in the hands of families, it can stimulate the economy as well, which is something that's obviously top of mind during this economic crisis.
Right. It's amazing how such little money can go so far and make a difference in people's lives. Thank you so much on that, Joe. And Anjali, for you, you spoke a bit about the fair share of resources and policy, social protection, which is really kind of a part of that automatic stabilizers we like. What is the foundation doing on those issues, please?
Yes, thanks, Kevin. So, work really needs to be done at all levels, yeah, local, national, and global. And the Fair Share to End Child Labor campaign that was launched in January does just that. It brings local and national voices into global discussions, places the focus on the direct testimony of former child laborers, and is building broad coalitions of representative student unions, trade unions, civil society, multilateral organizations, as well as faith and business leaders at the national and international level. The campaign is calling for a $100 billion global social protection fund. To provide a safety net for every child in low-income countries and national social protection floors in those countries with a minimum of 1% of GDP budgeted for direct child benefits, as well as the enforcement of existing child labor laws, which we know have been somewhat stalled because of lockdowns and just the inability to be able to have people out monitoring, but also then new legislation that really levels the playing field for companies around the world.
Great. Anjali and Joe, thank you so very much. I really look forward to continuing our work. It gives me encouragement that people like yourselves and those who are joining us on the call today are still dedicated to these issues. It is not a one and done situation. It is a constant reminder to us that we have to be very vigilant and diligent in our work. At this time, moving on, before we transition to the next panel, I would like to just provide some music and art, which, as we know, helps build the skills, empowers children, and really is quite important for children. For what we want them to be is to enjoy their childhood, to grow and to learn. The ILO, with the international community, has launched a Music Against Child Labor initiative. This was launched in 2013, and we have some of the greatest musicians in the world who are listening to these songs and judging them. I wanted to highlight the winner of this year's competition. The winner of the song competition in the global category is a band called, well, the singer is Bernice, her band MPA Cassidy, and the song is called I Did Not Ask, and it's coming to you from Burkina Faso. If you can play the song for us now.
Bonjour, je suis Bernice Pitropa, je viens du Burkina Faso. Je suis ravie de participer à ce projet contre le travail des enfants. Je remercie JM International, l'Organisation internationale du travail, les musiciens et le projet Clear Coton. Merci. Donnez-moi ma place. Je ne veux pas grandir avant l'âge. Donnez-moi ma place. Je ne veux pas grandir avant l'âge. Tous les jours je suis au champ, sous le soleil, comme les autres de 8 ans, mais je vis pas pareil. Le coton m'éblouit, la verdure est pleine de soucis. Je suis un enfant, j'ai plein de rêves. Je veux être comme le président, l'école fera de moi le prochain. Je veux tout apprendre du monde et venir en aide à mes prochains. Papa, donne-moi la chance, je serai ta meilleure semence. Maman, tu pries pour moi, que s'éloigne de moi la malchance. Pas qu'aussi, aïe, baba, pas qu'aussi. Pas qu'aussi, aïe, maman, pas qu'aussi. Mamia fobiga foya mambaba fonso manjes mamiele. Ma place est à l'école et pas dans les champs, non, 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 non. Ma place est à l'école et pas dans les champs, non, 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 non. Je veux aussi danser. Je veux aussi m'amuser. Je veux aussi danser. Je veux aussi m'amuser.
Thank you very much for that. Really a catchy tune. We were going to play a second song, but just to let you know, we're trying to keep the program to time. The second song category was on grassroots, and the band was MCAZ Student Band from Zimbabwe. Please go to the ILO's website and click on the song competition links for another great song. What I'd like to do as we transition to the next panel is to provide to you from the Association of the Farm Worker Opportunity Programs and its members serving farm workers in 49 states and Puerto Rico. This is a slideshow communicating their stories about the work that is being done, job training, pesticide safety, emergency assistance, and advocacy for people who prepare and harvest our food. We're pleased to be able to highlight some of the winning essays and the artwork today. If you would please play the slideshow, thank you.
Every year, between 300,000 and 500,000 migrant and seasonal farm worker children work in the fields under extreme work conditions in order to help support their families. And yet, they are not able to afford the food they harvest. On the following slides, you will see the art and essay representing the struggles and dreams migrant and seasonal farm worker children face daily. Working in the field requires sacrifice and effort, including getting up early, traveling long distances, and tolerating extreme temperatures. The first time I went to work in the fields, I could not believe how hard people worked for the little pay they received. When we finished, I was so tired that when I got home, I passed out from exhaustion. I slept until the next day. Yet my parents do it every day, from dusk till dawn. They never complain, they just do it. Nike should have a commercial for farm workers. The farm workers shown at the bottom represent the invisible community of migrant farm workers that feed the entire country. During my third season, I got a really bad shoulder injury while working in the cherries, and I almost lost my arm. I knew that if I kept working in the fields, there would be many more injuries, and I didn't want to put my body through that. If it weren't for that injury, I would still be working in the fields today. The father of the girl in this drawing is trying hard and risking his life, all as long as his daughter gets to the other side where she can have better opportunities to achieve her dreams. The hand represents the field workers doing their job under the sun. The road represents the industry that depends on agriculture. That summer, I was in apple orchards, cherry orchards, and blueberry fields. I wasn't just there that summer. I have since been there my entire life. I've worked with my parents and sisters in heat over 100 degrees, and I've learned to pack very little, very quick, because when you're moving so much, you quickly learn what the essentials are. The thorns are the challenges that my family as agricultural workers face every day. For example, health risks, lack of time dedicated to the family, and fear of ice raids. The blazing summer sun was shining down on us as I looked out across the rows and rows of cotton plants. I took a deep breath, wiped sweat off my forehead, and began my day of hoeing weeds that were taller than I was. Farm workers labor in terrible conditions. They have to work every day in the sun, rain, and snow. They have to stand or kneel all day and cannot stop. The child is assisting her father before she attends school, which is common for migrant children to help out before and after school. Summer days always meant waking up at the crack of dawn, working in the fields, and having to withstand the mosquitoes and sun in our faces. All the pain and aches from walking and bending was and always will be the worst days of my life. My mother always tells me, get an education so you will never have to work in the fields again. The hands represent hard work and the injuries sacrifice. They also represent my family because we all work in the fields. For more information, follow us on social media at CIF Campaign or visit our website at www.afop.org/CIF.
Tim, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, Anjali, and Joe for your remarks, and to the winners of this year's song competition and the art and essay competitions for the really inspiring and moving art and words. Next, I'd like to introduce our second panel. I'd like to introduce Judy Gearhart to give a few remarks on the challenges in addressing child labor in the cocoa sector, as well as moderate our second panel. Judy has really decades of labor activist experience in Central America and Mexico, Asia, Africa. She's the chair of the International Committee of the Child Labor Coalition, and presently is at the Accountability Research Center at American University. So Judy, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Tim, for that introduction. And thank you especially for your leadership on child labor throughout your career. I want to thank Kevin Cassidy and the entire ILO team for this invitation and for working with the Child Labor Coalition to organize the event. I especially want to thank Reed Maki, the coordinator of the Child Labor Coalition. He works behind the scenes to keep this very large coalition working collaboratively. We need to leverage this international year to eliminate child labor to build awareness, not only because child labor is on the rise due to the pandemic, as Joe told us, but for the same reasons we've always given. Children who labor lose twice. Their childhood is cut short and their ability to realize their full potential as adults is undermined as well. It's pretty basic. 20 years ago, the US government, at the behest of Senator Harkin and Congressman Engel, set out to end child labor in the cocoa growing regions of Ivory Coast and Ghana. These two countries supply 60% of the world's cocoa, what is arguably a luxury product. And yet, the majority of cocoa farmers and farm workers live in extreme poverty. The Harkin-Engel Protocol was an ambitious program for its time 20 years ago, but the chocolate companies successfully lobbied against the protocol becoming legally binding, and now the results have come up short. This is the year to revamp those strategies. The Child Labor Coalition recently put forward a number of recommendations in a letter to Secretary Walsh for identifying new strategies in cocoa and other agricultural sectors around the world. In short, these are to create an action plan and an oversight body that includes independent trade unions and civil society, especially those that are nationally based and anchored in the cocoa growing communities. Second, to ensure adequate financing and capacity building so that civil society is able to participate as equals with companies and governments in a meaningful way to develop and guide future programs in the cocoa industry. The third is to propose legislation to address gaps in existing laws and strengthen protections for children working in global supply chains. And finally, to continue monitoring and reporting on progress to advance accountability and transparency in the sector. We have been grateful for those regular reports coming out of iLab every 4 years and annually. Together, the Child Labor Coalition is working with the European-based Foist Network, another coalition of civil society groups working for solutions. And we're working together to include regulations for mandatory human rights due diligence for companies operating in all major cocoa consuming countries, including avenues for legal remedy for those companies' home countries. We very much look forward to working with the Department of Labor on these recommendations. Within the Child Labor Coalition, we're clear, thanks to the American Federation of Teachers, Dr. Loretta Johnson, our co-chair, and other labor leaders who guide the coalition. We cannot solve child labor if we do not address workers' rights fully. It is not enough. In fact, it's misleading for companies to sponsor high-profile programs to end child labor or human trafficking if they do not also respect workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively and ensure those rights throughout their supply chain. The panel we have three experts today, and they're all experts in child labor in the agriculture sector. The reason, as Sally signaled in the beginning, is because the majority of child labor happens in agriculture. I'm going to introduce all of them together and then give each of them a few minutes to highlight the challenges and solutions that they advocate for addressing child labor in agriculture. Then we'll come back for concluding remarks from each one before we open it up to questions. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A tab. First, we'll have Norma Flores Lopez, who's worked in the fields from age 12 to 18 across the US. She has served as director of the Children in the Fields campaign with the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs. She's now the chief program officer for Justice for Migrant Women. She's also the chair of the Child Labor Coalition's Domestic Issues Committee and continues to mentor many farm worker youth. Her life, her career, and her willingness to share those experiences are really mean that she is very much deserving of the honor of having received the Iqbal Masih Award. Congratulations, Norma. After Norma, we'll hear from Jacqueline Palacios, a rising senior at Adams State University in Colorado. Jacqueline is interning with the Child Labor Coalition and Justice for Migrant Women. She's working to advance legislation to protect child farm workers. As a teen, Jacqueline also worked in the fields with her family alongside many other child farm workers. She's here to share those experiences. Finally, we'll hear from Andrews Tagaway. Andrews is the Deputy General Secretary of the General Agriculture Workers Union of Ghana, and he's the Regional Director for Global March's Anglophone Africa region. He has been advocating for children's rights and decent work for all across various agriculture sectors for more than 2 decades. Andy has a community level perspective on what makes for effective programs, and we very much need his leadership now as the international community is seeking new strategies in sectors like cocoa and other crops. I'm going to turn it over to Norma. And you'll have 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Judy, and thank you for those wonderful, kind words. Hi, everyone. Really an honor to be able to share my perspective in this panel. As Judy mentioned, I have dedicated my career to being able to bring awareness to the issues that many of our children are facing today, those children that are harvesting the fruits and vegetables that we enjoy every day. And these are children not somewhere else in the world, but here in the United States, it's in our own backyard. And oftentimes I think people have that disconnect, don't realize that child labor is a real issue that the United States is dealing with. By estimates of advocates based on data from the Department of Labor, there are as many as 500,000 farm worker children that are working in agriculture in the United States. And these children start working in ages as young as 8, sometimes even younger from some kids that I've talked to. My own experience, I started working at the age of 9, but legally on the books starting at the age of 12. And what it means to start working at the age of 12 is sometimes 72-hour weeks, 10 to 12-hour days, sometimes weeks at a time without any days off. And that's pretty normal for our farm worker community. I grew up as a migrant farm worker child, where my family had to pack up our belongings and we had to travel across the country following the harvest to be able to make ends meet at home. And so my income was needed so that our family could be able to survive. And the reality is that agricultural work is hard, it is demanding, and it is incredibly dangerous. It is right up there with mining and with construction. And yet this is something that we see across rural America every day. These children are exposed regularly to high levels of pesticides and chemicals that are used in agricultural work, which of course increases their risk for cancer and other long-term health effects. It has a huge impact on those developing bodies of children. The Environmental Protection Agency has concluded that children are 3 times more susceptible to the carcinogenic effects of pesticides than adults are. The reality is that children are not tiny adults. Their bodies are, again, developing. They're much more vulnerable. They're much more vulnerable to things like heat stress, to much of the dangers that are out there in agriculture, the extreme weather conditions. Not only that, but then in addition, they're also susceptible to getting hurt with operating heavy machinery or using dangerous sharp tools. And just overall, as I mentioned, it's difficult work on a body, having to be stooped over, having to be carrying heavy loads, having to be able to do work and expected to keep up with that of an adult. And what we have seen is that through COVID, it's only increased the number of children that are out there, with children being pulled out of school, with children not having access to being able to receive their meals from the school, especially in rural America, not having good connection, as many rural communities where farm workers live don't have that reliable broadband service that they need, don't have sometimes the equipment that they need to be able to connect with schools, the laptops, the tablets, and their parents who do not have high rates of educational attainment and maybe even the language barriers. It became a really big issue for these children. And what we ended up seeing is that many children who were out of school ended up joining their parents in the fields because the parents also could not afford to stay at home to watch over these children and afford to not bring home the income. So what we're seeing is that families, even including their children, were risking their health, their lives, to be able to continue putting those fruits and vegetables on our plates every single day, even though they themselves were struggling to be able to feed their families. All of this during a global pandemic, because of course you cannot work from home when you're having to do agricultural work. And again, even more recent reports have shown that the Government Accountability Office, for example, suggested that 100,000 child workers were injured on the job every year, and that children account for 20% of farming fatalities. I mean, it's painting a stark picture before COVID came around. And now with COVID, we are very much afraid of the reports of what's going to come like here in the United States. And so what is the solution to this? Well, all of these examples of these harsh realities that farm worker children are facing, they're all legal right now within the United States. Children under US law are able to work with very few protections and safeguards starting at the age of 12. And in some situations, some instances, you even get them younger than that, especially for children on family farms. There are literally no restrictions on the type of work and the hours that these children can work at. And the problem with that is that there's very few safeguards for these children. There's very little enforcement of this. And you have then children that are risking their childhood, their health, their education to be able to help their families make ends meet. And it results in terrible health outcomes for the children. It results in children dropping out 4 times the national rate. And so there is a bill that has been introduced in the past with Congress, the Children's Act for Responsible Employment, that would equalize the child labor laws. What does this mean? That means that the same way that there are safeguards and children are kept from doing dangerous tasks for unlimited hours in every other industry, we want to see that same care being put in agriculture, again, in one of the most dangerous industries. We want children to be doing safe work for safe hours, that their health and their education is paramount, the same way that we see it everywhere else. And we want to be able to see that same energy, that same investment that the United States Department of Labor gives to other countries to be able to help them eliminate child labor, to dedicate some of those resources here within the United States and make sure that our children are being kept safe too. So we'll get to hear shortly from Jacqueline, who will share some of her experiences, but just know that that experience is not unique. Those are the same stories that we heard from children around the world, children here, children that went out to the fields with me as I was growing up, the stories of my parents, there's a lot of things that are just continue to be the same. And really at the root of it is keeping farm workers from being able to organize, from being able to have fair pay, from being able to feed their families. And so until we address some of those root causes, couple that with better enforcement, better laws, we're going to continue to have this issue of child labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norma. Jacqueline?
Yes. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jacqueline Palacios. As Norma mentioned, I am from Alamosa, Colorado. It's a very small town, and I'm in my last year at Adams State University. So with that being said, my summers before college were designated to working, and that was working on the fields. And my first time working there, I was actually about 14 years old, legally, as Norma mentioned with her story as well. My days consisted of waking up at 6 in the morning, and it was an hour drive to where I worked at. And so we would pack our lunch and we would make the drive to the fields. And I live in a very high elevation area, so the sun hits harder and stronger, so you get sunburnt quicker. And so the sun was really bright, but since it was the morning, the field was just watered. So I do recall being wet from, head to toes, especially because some of the weeds that we did were as tall as me. And sorry, I didn't mention, I actually worked in the potato fields. So my job was to yank weeds from the rows filled with potatoes. And it varied. The weeds were either as tall as me or shorter than me. So I was bending down all day, yanking them out. And so my sisters and I worked together along with my grandpa as well. I do recall my hands being really sore and swollen because it felt like rope burn from yanking the weeds all day. And I didn't have rubber pants to protect my clothing. So I was wet all day and I felt sticky because I would go from being cold and wet in the morning and then sweating when midday would hit because the sun was just beaming on our bodies. And so I remember our lunch break was only 30 minutes. And to me, that was the best part of the day because I was able to drink water for one, which felt amazing afterwards. And we were able to eat. And just that little 30-minute breaks, it wasn't enough, but it was better than nothing to get the break that we needed and our bodies needed. And so after our day was done of yanking weeds, we do about 1 or 2 fields a day, depending on how big the field was. We did finish our day around 4 or 5 p.m. Then we would drive back home. And like I mentioned, it was a hour drive. So that's when I instantly would feel my body throbbing. Like my body was just telling me, what are you doing? I was aching. Sometimes I'd have headaches. I was definitely dehydrated. I was really tired. I didn't want to do anything. I would get home and I remember me and my sisters literally just dropping our stuff, our backpacks where we had our lunch, and we would lay on our living room floor and just stare at the ceiling until we could finally have the motivation to get up again because we were just so exhausted and it was so tiring. And I finally was happy to be around air conditioner because like being outside, you get what the wind blows, which in the summertime is not very much. And so with that being said, I do recall it being an interesting journey, no regrets, but I definitely don't recommend it for children because it did take away a lot of my childhood that I wish I could have done differently, such as camps or sports, or just in general enjoying my childhood experience with my family because I did stay. Me and my family kind of didn't really, we did interact, but we didn't see each other that much because we were both at work. So everyone was gone from home. And so there wasn't much of that family time. And so now where I stand, I haven't worked in the fields, but every now and then I will help my mom. Like last year in the pandemic was the last time I was in the field sorting potatoes. But now I don't hold jobs like that anymore. I've actually upgraded and I went to housekeeping after that, which was like glory to me because I was like, yay, air conditioning. There was a rooftop over me. I didn't have to be out in the fields. And so that was a great experience. And then now in college, I'm actually working in offices around my campus. And so I compare and contrast my jobs. I think about it like, yes, the fields was more of like, it was a good time for the age that I had, but it wasn't as as relieving as working in an office. Like, for example, when I'm in the office working for my work studies, it feels almost too easy for the work that I'm doing because I'm so used to, constant movement. I'm moving around, I'm pulling weeds, whatever it is. And so when I sit in a chair and just do a task that my boss assigns me and I'm done, I'm just like, wow, this is a little boring, but I'm done. And I at least get the job done. So I would take that any day over the fields though. So I will clarify that. And so several things I learned throughout my journey. And some of those was resilience. I got turned down a lot, especially in jobs as a youngin. And of course the fields was where I thought I was destined to go because it's what my family worked in. And it's what, like, the only job I could get legally because I couldn't work at a store or any of that. I wasn't old enough. And it also taught me willpower. I was tempted to give up a lot because it's hard work. You start getting, you're not really motivated to go to school. You get tired. You're too tired to socialize. So at times you just want to give up. But I didn't, because at the end of the day, I wanted to keep my family moving. And I didn't want them to be working because it's sad when you see your parents out in the sun, just trying their hardest to get enough food on the table for their whole family. And so with that being said, it also taught me humility because I'm more grateful for the small things that I have now, because my parents unfortunately were not able to continue their education like I am right now, because they had to give up their education to help my grandparents work for their families. So that's a really grateful opportunity that I have here living in the United States, which I appreciate every single day. And just jobs in general, I do get to choose now what kind of job I want because I do have education now and I have much more experience. So I'm very fortunate for that. So it was a good life lesson working out in the fields, but I wouldn't recommend it for children. Like I said, it takes away their childhood, what they should be doing, playing around in the neighborhood, wherever you live. Spending time with your family is just not a safe place for children to be out in the fields. It's pretty sad to still see to this day, as all of you mentioned, just seeing children all over the globe working. It's not fair to them. It's obviously not fun for them. And I just hope it changes soon and those numbers decrease. And thank you guys for your time.
Wow, Jacqueline, thank you so much for that incredibly vivid description. You are really very articulate, and I think you will go far.
Thank you.
Now to Andy Tagway to share his perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And I want to congratulate Norma also for the award. Indeed, farm workers must be allowed to organize as a matter of right. And it is only when farmers are organized and they are allowed to sit by the table to discuss their own issue that we can see the real problem and begin to solve it. I bring you greetings from farmers and farm workers in rural communities in Ghana. More greetings also from children on Lake Volta fishing, whose activities include getting up early in the morning around 4 a.m. to the lake and going to throw net into the deep part of the water. And then after throwing the net, hours later, they have to go under the water because the net is tangled by tree shrubs under the water. Some of them are maimed and some of them are not lucky. They do not come back because of the depth of water. I bring you greetings also from Freeman. Freeman Gadri is a child who had been rescued and is completed university, and today is supporting our advocacy action. And Freeman has supported his brother, who was a child laborer, to also finish university and also be a teacher and an advocate. I also bring you greetings from Jejo, a very beautiful lady involved in child labor in agriculture, who have been rescued and have gone to university, and today she is a teacher in a Montessori school. Indeed, the child labor issue is a very complex one, and I've always cited that it's just like a giraffe. Giraffe is a very huge animal. If you are very far away from it, you see only the small head and you think it's a small animal. But when you draw closer to it, you see how short you are and how complicated the giraffe is. So child labor is a huge problem and it's a complex problem, but we can derive simple solutions and to solve child labor. It is possible. Like Kevin said in the numbers that Kevin gave us from the ILO, behind all those numbers are faces of innocent children who are suffering in the lake fishing, who are suffering in oil palm, who are suffering in rice production, who are even working as peasant farmers and are exposed to agrochemicals, like my colleagues have said. Some of them are in cattle herding, etc. Some of them are walking very long distances to farms, and they are removing nets from entangled in lakes and in cocoa production. What worsens the situation is sometimes the denial that there is no child labor, and that's a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a step, and understanding the problem is half the solution. So we have to move away from the state of denial, and thank God we are winning that battle gradually. Continuous denial of the problem coupled with some cultural beliefs and practices, lack of alternatives, and agriculture, as Norma said, being the third most dangerous occupation, and exposing children to this area exposes them to more dangers, especially when they are not guided. Freeman tells me that he is grateful for the collaboration between GAWU, the government, and the support our colleagues have given, the Global March and the Fair Share campaign. Freeman is happy today for what has happened. Also, Jejom, who is the beautiful lady, also says that she was not only born for the kitchen, but now she is in school and she has completed and teaching, and she can do what she wants to do as a girl. For all we have called on actions, trade unions and civil society organizations in the cocoa industry and our governments should begin to work together. We are very excited to hear at the CLCCG meeting that it will include more national unions and civil society organizations to be deeply engaged in developing solutions for the sector. We are so grateful to the CLCCG, where I have been participating, and now we are expanding to cover more labor groups and labor organizations. The farmers must be at the table, represented by their own organizations. The statistics that Kevin gave out shows completely that we have disappointed the children, and I meet them every day, and we need to do something new, something unique. The status quo must change. We must start to do something new. We must begin to think outside the box. The strategies that we have used, comrades, in the past have not worked. But I'm happy to say that in Ghana here, there are a few methodologies that we have tried and we have experimented. Over the past 20 years of my work in rural communities, we have done many things that did not work, but gradually we know what to do. We know what the solutions are. We know where the children are. We know what can solve the problem. We know where the farms are, and we are ready and we are capable, and with the slightest push, we are ready to ensure that agriculture without child labor and agriculture without child labor is also possible. We have talked about the problems a lot. What do we do? How do we go forward? We think that we need to continue to promote decent work within the value chain. The farmers' right is not negotiable. Farmers must be allowed to organize. When farmers themselves enjoy decent work and they themselves are working under safe conditions and they don't get sick, then they can bring their children out of it. When a farmer gets sick, working in a very undecent condition, it is likely that his child must go to the farm, and that is where the danger is. We also call for support for national tripartite structures, that is the national plans of action that are using tripartite structures. We call for support, and we call for support for community-based initiatives. What have worked for us in the past 20 years is what we call the integrated approaches toward child labor labor-free zones that have used the community systems as the center of action. The community chief is empowered to declare his community a child labor-free zone. The teachers are empowered. The community systems, the school management committees, the children themselves, the local unions and organized farmer groups themselves, the community monitoring committees, all these community systems are empowered, and they have the potential, like we have experimented, to monitor community-based child labor. They are the potential, as we have experimented, to identify any child that is trafficked into any community. We think that community initiative and community-based strategies, also inherent in them, has the potential to help in the overall rural development processes. And all this will be seated around farmers who are well organized, and they have their rights to call duty bearers to action. We also say that because of the enormity of the child labor program or child labor problem, the partnerships in addressing child labor is very important. We all call for partnerships. The unions will work the way we work, and our colleagues in civil society will work the way we work, and then governments will also do what they have to do, and our international colleagues too will also work with us. The farmers need a voice. They need to bridge the representational gap. And we are looking at West African cocoa farmers on child labor. And this West African cocoa farmers, once we are able to get them, we have started gradually with the cocoa farmers. The trade unions in Ghana have opened a cocoa farmer division. So for the first time, a trade union, cocoa farmer who wants to join the trade union in Ghana can and freely join. And we have a number of members who have done that. We should continue to respect ILO fundamental rights. We have ratified them, and we must domesticate and implement the structures. We must strengthen the national small cooperatives. And when I say cooperatives here, I mean self-organized cooperatives, not pseudo cooperatives organized for economic interest. Here we are talking about farmers coming together themselves. We believe strongly that agriculture without child labor is possible, and that starts from you. Last week, the Secretary General of the Trade Union Congress, in his statement, said that we now see the enormity of the child labor problem, and the trade unions are now ready to join partners to address child labor in Ghana and, for that matter, in the West African region. One of the big challenges that we have is also the definition of who the cocoa farmer is. When it comes to cocoa farmers, the cocoa farmer is there. We have people in the cocoa farm who are cocoa farm workers. Most often, design strategies do not reach them. We know what to do. Child labor-free zones are possible. And we think that a child labor-free zone that began in some communities with the child labor-free families, child labor-free communities, child labor-free districts, and the child labor-free countries. So we must begin. Like I said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a step. And that step, that bold step, we must all come together and take that step now. We thank you so much for this opportunity to share some of our experiences on the ground. And because it's just 5 minutes, and I want to respect time, I will end here. And if there are some questions, we will be willing to address it. When I say child labor, you say away, child labor, away, child labor, away. Thank you very much, Judy.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was great. And thank you for that analogy of the giraffe. I think it's really helpful, and for the commitment of the unions to really work at the community level. We're going to bring back our first two panelists, Anjali Kochar and Joe Becker, and we're going to start with the questions now. I want to just summarize 3 high-level questions for you, some of which I pulled from the Q&A. I think we really have time for just one round, so you can answer these questions or make whatever additional comment you make. But please, if you can keep your answers to a minute or 90 seconds, that would be helpful, because we are aiming to end on time. But I think these presentations have been incredible. So the one question is, President Biden, the Biden administration, has made some really positive statements about wanting to resume US leadership on human rights. and wanting to support workers' rights, better wages, trade union rights. So I think there's an opportunity here, and the question to you all is, what would you ask of the Biden administration? What's your top level ask? Some of you may want to answer that, or some of you may want to answer the other questions in the Q&A, which are related. One is about corporate accountability, especially with regards to Joe's study. Those questions were coming in as to what are you thinking in terms of driving greater corporate accountability. And then related to that, there's a comment about the ineffectiveness. So due diligence laws are happening and companies are doing due diligence on human rights abuses in their supply chain, but it doesn't seem to be having an effect on the ground. That's a comment from Caroline Bowden, and I think it's an absolutely appropriate comment that should be addressed. So I want to turn it over to the six of you, and I'm going to start with Jacqueline, or maybe actually I could give you time and just however you prefer to answer. If you're up for it, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you, Judy. So as you guys mentioned, if I could ask Biden what I want to see after everything is processed on income, the outcome I would like to see would be, as you guys mentioned, the increase in farmer wages, just so it can prevent children from having to go into the fields to work in there to help sustain their family. And like I mentioned before in my story, it helps gain the future children to, gain back their childhood, so these generations don't keep following the same trend of working out in the fields. And I was also thinking of like a similar thing that the military has, like once you're in, and even though you're not active duty, you will still receive the benefits afterwards. So I was thinking something similar like that for the farmers, to cover them, obviously their insurance, have benefits of having to have worked in the fields, because they are the ones who feed not just America, the whole globe in general, any farmer anywhere. And so I would like to see that, especially because I think of my parents, for example, their bodies still ache. And I wish that that wasn't the case, because if there was maybe a doctor nearby that like, oh, you worked in the farm, like, let me help you right away. Just like, the military, oh, you're in the military, you have this help, you have all these resources to go after. And so I just wish there was something similar like that for the farm workers, because I really feel like they deserve it. And another one would be better working conditions. As I mentioned in my previous story, 30 minutes is not enough for lunchtime. I don't know how everyone else's situation was, but I recall telling Nodma, like, we had a porta potty to wash and clean our hands, and they weren't very sanitized. So I wish that there was a better place for us to do all that. And I've heard of people also, wherever they stay, their cabins, they're too tiny, or they're not very kept up. And so that's very unfortunate. It's very sad to hear that there's like up to 5+ family members living in a home like that. Because to me, it's kind of like, not even animals should be treated like that, but like, it's kind of like they're looking at us like, oh, you're there, I'm just going to put you there. And it's not fair, because, we're all human. So.
Thank you. Those are great recommendations. I'd like to turn it over to Norma and then to Andy, and then we'll have Anjali and Joe close us out, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. Well, Jackie already mentioned amazing ideas of what we could ask the Biden administration. And I do want to invite folks that want to learn more about child labor here in the US to visit the Child Labor Coalition, to visit the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs. Their social media and their websites can answer many of the questions that are posed on here, and don't want to go into depth with those because we're limited time. But I do want to point out that there's a lot for the Biden administration to be able to do. We definitely need a comprehensive approach about this. There's not going to be a single policy solution that's going to solve everything, because it's a very complicated issue rooted in decades and centuries of oppression, and that really need to be dismantled right from the root. I had already mentioned some steps that we want Congress to take, like equalizing child labor laws, things like immigration reform, that incredibly important. But there are things that the Biden administration can do right now, that the Department of Labor can do right now. One is the safeguards. They could be able to update the list of the hazardous orders to make sure that young children are not doing incredibly dangerous jobs and putting their lives at risk. And that's the list of the most dangerous jobs that right now 12-year-olds are still being allowed to do. They can be able to increase enforcement of the laws that do exist, to be able to stop taking funding out of those departments and go out there and enforce the few laws that are in place, and to be able to make sure that children are being safe out there, especially young girls. I didn't get a chance to talk into it, but young girls are especially vulnerable to all of the dangers of doing agricultural work and also to sexual assault. And this only gets compounded for those families that are coming from undocumented parents or mixed status families. And so we're especially concerned about them and urge the Department of Labor to do targeted enforcement and to make sure that is not lost or forgotten in the budget cuts. And the next piece that I'll close out with is data collection. We need better data collection here in the US. It's really hard to pin down the numbers. It's really hard to be able to show just how dangerous it is, but we know it is because we talk to kids like Jackie that tell us about the terrible experience that they've had, the injuries that they've had, the long-term effects that this has on them. And so those are real ways that the Biden administration, that the Department of Labor can act now to make sure that we're keeping our children safe here in the US.
Thank you, Norma. And I'm gonna, Andy, your brother, Kirill Bukatov from the IUF is saying in the comments, he's calling out the need to respect farm worker organizing rights in the US, which obviously is echoing what you said. Let me turn it to you.
Thank you very much. I will come to the president because I have a very good information for Mr. President. But I want to say that first, you see, where the employers and then the unions have worked together in the formal setting in Ghana, for now, there is no child labor. So in the formal setting, because of the collective agreements, there is no child labor. The challenge is in the informal economy because unions have not organized. And that is what we have started. And we are promoting rights, and that is where investment is needed. And I also want to just say that during the COVID, the partial lockdown, the places where the unions were working, we predicted that most girls will leave COVID instead of to the classroom, they will leave to the maternity homes because they are going to get pregnant. And they were vulnerable because they were in the compound houses. In the compound house in Ghana, when you lock the house, it's not possible to live inside. They will come out and they were exposed. And true, believe you me, the areas that we use teachers to solve the problem, we reduce the problem. But the areas that the unions were not available, statistics had it that more than 30% of the girls from the classroom, they went to the maternity homes from the lockdown, not to the classroom. What I want to tell Mr. President is that, Mr. President, thank you very much for recognizing the rights of workers, for recognizing that workers need to be at the table, not as infidels, but also with equal rights. We sit at the table and then talk. What I'm expecting, Mr. President, is that this information will trickle down to the US policies in our countries, such that the embassies will begin to work with the unions. The USAID will begin to work with the unions, so that all the United States programs that comes to Africa and the rest of the world will recognize labor rights and union rights and workers' rights and women's rights and rural community rights as key even to addressing child labor. We can. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. Joe, can I turn it to you? And then Anjali with the final call to action, because I know this is really the beginning. We need to keep doing more this year.
Sure, thanks, Judy. I'll pick up the question about corporate accountability, which I think is really important. I think the pandemic has really highlighted the responsibility of companies to make sure that they're not selling products that are made with child labor or other human rights abuses. And this means really reassessing their supply chains in light of the pandemic to assess new risks and taking action to move children out of their supply chain and back into school. But I think, as Judy pointed out, the scheme that we have now is primarily voluntary. We have, just tons of different voluntary initiatives and standards. And what we're seeing is that it's just not enough. Some companies make an effort while others do very little or nothing. So I think, what an additional step that we need is really mandatory due diligence laws. And there was a step forward just today. The German parliament adopted a new supply chains law that will require German companies to assess their supply chains on a regular basis for child labor and other human rights abuses. But we need these in the United States, tougher ones than we have, and global standards as well through the ILO to really make sure that companies are doing all they can to avoid child labor and other human rights abuses. Thanks.
Thank you, Jo. Anjali?
Thanks, Judy. And thanks everybody for those questions. You know, just to pick up on a couple of points, Norma made the point that there is not one answer, right? There is this collective of ways where we can actually change policies and have impact. And Jo's talked about due diligence. She's also talked about cash transfers. We've talked about larger global protection programs. And so I think what it means is that we need to come at this from all different corners and all different viewpoints. And just to kind of leave us, I mean, I've got some ideas on what we can ask President Biden. I think one thing that we actually haven't touched upon goes back to Kevin's question on how do we provide funding, or how do low-income countries actually find funding to do some of this work. And, you know, the G7 has actually come out with come out in support of changing international tax structures, which actually would potentially lead to companies that are doing business in low-income countries, leaving their tax monies there so that low-income countries have access to resources that was generated in their own country to then provide programming and safety nets for their own people. And so this it is this sense of how do we help amplify the work and the voices of those on the ground that actually see what needs to happen at any given moment in time. And so just for some next steps, if anybody wants to get involved, has partner organizations around the world, we'd love to connect partners in country with national coalitions that have been formed through the Fair Share to End Child Labor campaign. And so if there is interest, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect at country level. And here in the US, the Child Labor Coalition is exploring ways to be part of this campaign as well. And so feel free to reach out to Reed or myself, but it will take all of us, and it really will take our collective energy and anger, I think, at this moment in time to really propel us forward. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Anjali. And anger, sometimes that can be the greatest motivator, and you're right, we should be outraged. I want to thank all of our moderators and panelists today. And these last concluding remarks were tremendous. Here at the Accountability Research Center at American University, we're all about lifting up the analysis and perspectives of community organizations and social movements, both to strengthen their work, and also because we think that they have essential perspectives for improving the development policies and programs and their impact that so many people in Washington are working on today. Norma, Jacqueline, and Andy, you all outlined the importance of community-based solutions and addressing inequality and putting power in the hands of farm workers. I hope these are solutions many others can support. Jo, your report, it's an important call to action. We cannot let the pandemic reverse progress. It can't undermine the futures of more children. Anjali, the ways you've outlined to engage through the Kailash Satyarthi Foundation and the Fair Share for Children's campaign, I hope people will take it up. You should put the link in the chat. I want to encourage everyone participating today to stay involved. I believe the ILO will be hosting events throughout this UN year to eliminate child labor, and you can find more things to get involved in on their website. Also, of course, the Child Labor Coalition, you can follow on Twitter. I think Reed put that in the chat as well. And there are just many ways. The question about due diligence, there's a legislative committee within the Child Labor Coalition that's both working on the proposals Norma's doing and on due diligence issues. So lots of ways to get involved and stay connected. Given the impact of the pandemic, we really need all hands on deck. As Tim Ryan said in the beginning, whatever the numbers may be, the history and this moment demand that the year 2021 is the crucial year for serious concerted action against child labor, and not just feel-good commemoration of work already done. We really need to take it as a call to action and not a self-congratulatory year. I'll close with a quote from, actually I'll close with two quotes. Nelson Mandela once said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children." I think it's an important reflection, and we all need to be doing that soul searching. And then I'll close with Senator Tom Harkin and a quote he gave a few years ago: "A nation can neither achieve nor sustain prosperity on the backs of its children. In the global economy, the exploitation of children must not be tolerated under any circumstances for any reason." And Anjali, your points were excellent. I think that is actually it. The tremendous wealth that's been created in the global economy is all the more reason that we need to solve child labor now. I want to thank everybody for participating today, and again to the panelists and the moderators. Have a good weekend and rest of your day.